Okay, so if you were around last week, then I talked about schemas, and I said that I was talking about schemas as part and parcel of talking about cognitive load theory. And so today we get on to sort of the main event, which is cognitive load theory. If you've been paying any kind of attention to the teacher Twitter or some of the arguments that are going on about how teaching should be taught in initial teacher training, then you'll perhaps know that cognitive load theory has become very big very quickly within a lot of people's thinking about how teaching should be taught. There are a few proponents of cognitive load theory who managed to catch the ear of successive Tory education secretaries, which has meant that it's become a very popular approach. It's also very much the kind of approach that's espoused at things like Research Ed, which is a bit more grassroots, teachers getting out and talking at the weekends to each other about how research can apply to teaching. And so it's very much the a la mode theory. And unlike a lot of research and a lot of sort of theories to do with teaching, it's actually based in some really good science. And that's that there's a thing called working memory, and that working memory is incredibly limited. And that is that's a result that is not disputed by anybody. That psychologists do tests on working memory again and again and again, and every time they find that it's really, really limited. And the kind of tests that they do, are sort of this block here shows what goes on, is our working memory just is holding what we're thinking at the moment. Is, if you know your computer's a bit like random access memory, it's working on what we're thinking about at that moment. And if we want to keep something in the working memory for any length of time, then we need to rehearse it. We need to keep going over it. If you've got a shopping list and you're on the way and you realise you've not got it written down on a bit of paper, then you have to keep, as you're driving along, keep thinking, oh God, I mustn't forget to buy the milk. I mustn't forget to buy it. So you've got to keep on rehearsing it. And so what psychologists do is they do tests where they suppress rehearsal. So they give you a set of things to remember, and then they give you something else to do at the same time. And the something else, trivial, sing a song or whatever the hell it might be, is there to prevent you from doing the repeating it continuously in your head. And then once you've done the distraction task, they go back and see how many of the original things you've managed to remember. And for pretty much everybody, it's not many. It ends up being somewhere between 4 and 7 things. Quite how many depends on exactly what kind of test is being done. But for most people, it would seem that we can hold 5, 6 things in our head at once while still having, still being able to cope with distraction tasks. We can hold a lot more than that if we're rehearsing it, if we're chanting it over and over again. But if we're being prevented from doing that, it's maybe 5 things that we can manage to hold in our heads. And so working memory is really well established. I don't think there's any psychologist who's going to come out and say, no, that's not true. And a chap called Baddeley did a lot of the original work on this, and he decided that there were 2 working memories. There was a working memory for things you see and for spatial relationships, and there was a working memory for language, and that each one of those could store 4 or 5 things. So we maybe had 10 things that we could store at once, providing 5 of them were about the spatial relationship between stuff and 5 of them are about words. And it's hit this Baddeley's idea of exactly how the working memory works that most of cognitive load theory is based upon. Baddeley's extended that since. This is from one of his much more recent papers, and there's now loads and loads of research out there into functional MRI, where they look at what the brain's doing as they ask you to think things, that suggests that actually there's working memories for quite a lot of the senses. And maybe it's a lot more than 10 things that can be held, providing each one of the things is connected to a different area of the brain with its own working memory. And so it might not be just those 2, the the spatial relationship between things and language. There might be some others in there, smell, taste. You can see the things that are on that diagram there. But at the moment, that's speculative. Most researchers into working memory are quite happy. There's 5 things, 4 things, and that's all you're going to be able to remember. So, summary of what I've just said. Working memory limited to 4 to 7 things. There might be extra working memories. Then maybe as teachers we can take advantage, and that comes up later, we can take advantage of the fact that there's more than one working memory type. And of course, this is interesting. Why does working memory, why is it significant to teaching? Well, it certainly very strongly correlates with lots and lots of desirable academic traits. I was reading a paper that had a list of about 20 things that you might want to test for as a teacher, and a fair chunk of those 20 correlated quite nicely with scores on working memory tests. So, if you score 4 and your mate scores 5, you're probably going to score higher on things like problem solving and your reading level and those kinds of things. So working memory is not a bad tool, to get an idea how good or otherwise a student is. And of course, we'd like to be able to improve it, but that's questioned. Now, whether it's actually physical buffers. Buffers might not mean much to you if you're not into computers, but sort of the original computers were extraordinarily limited by how much they could hold in their memories at any one moment, and therefore what they could be doing processing on. And computers, right into early desktop PCs and things, their big limitation on what they could do, how fast the game you could play was, how many cells you could have in Excel doing a calculation all at once, was limited by the physical memory buffers of the computer. And so the trouble I have with Baddeley's interpretation of working memory is it feels a bit computer 1.0 to me. It feels like he's describing computers as computers were at their time. And is that really what the brain is? And so the alternative view is led by a researcher called Nelson Cohen. And he says that actually what the working memory is representing is not, individual slots in your brain to store 4 things in. But what the working memory is representing is an individual's ability to concentrate. And that maybe we can hold 20 things, providing we don't have to hold much detail about those 20 things. We can hold 4 things really well. We can hold 20 things vaguely. It's about how tight your focus is and how well you can maintain a concentration, rather than some physical space in your brain that, the word peanut has been slotted into for that particular memory test that you happen to be doing. And so Baddeley's view isn't, although working memory is accepted by all psychologists, Baddeley's view that it's, a physical, a sort of a storage space within the brain is not necessarily accepted by all psychology researchers. Now, as I've sort of suggested, we would like working memory is a really important trait, so we'd like to improve working memory. And so there are lots of things out there to train the working memory. There was that brain training that was a big thing on when personal screens became mainstream, and it was thinking about training sort of working memory type exercises. And so there's loads of people out there selling things that claim to improve working memory. But as you can see from this analysis of the results of all those working memory, there's very few of those tests of whether working memory actually makes any kind of working memory training actually makes any kind of difference to anybody. There's very few of them whose error bars don't touch 0. So that means in sort of statistical speak, none of them are significant, because it's only a test is only significant if its error bars don't include 0, because if the error bars include 0, there's a high likelihood that actually what you've found is a statistical anomaly, or you sort of fudging the data. It's not a real effect. You can only be pretty happy it's a real effect if your error bars don't include 0. You can see there that all of those measurements do. And so working memory training has not been convincingly found to do anything very much, other than maybe increase your score on the brain training thing that you happen to be doing at the time. It doesn't actually seem to make any difference to your IQ or anything along those lines, all those things that we might hope that working memory training would help with. Anyway, as I said, there was historically, when the Tories came to power after a long time with Labour, there were a few very noisy teachers managed to attract the attention, actually get themselves meetings at the Department for Education, because um, those of you like me who've been around for a little while will remember all of that training that's said we should be letting them discover it for themselves. We should be letting them transmit it to each other via interactive dance. All that kind of cliche of what teacher training is all about. And that was very much its height in the early to mid 2000s. And these guys took this paper in particular. These guys, this is the paper they quote. John Sweller is the man credited with developing the cognitive load theory. He's been developing it since the 1980s, and he, with particularly Kirshner, wrote this paper. You've no doubt seen the title there, explaining why cognitive load theory says that all of these, leave them to find it out for themselves stuff just is never going to work. And essentially, this is the killer paragraph as to what it's saying there, is that if you're leaving them sort it out for themselves, you're giving them a complicated bit of maths, saying you work out how to do that complicated bit of maths instead of doing a worked example on the board. All of the working memory, all of the memory load goes into that working out what the hell's going on and trying to work out how do I get into this problem in the first place. And none of it is actually going on the stuff you want it to, like remembering how to do this problem. And so those kinds of approaches back in the 90s and the 2000s were being offered up as, you should be getting the kids to find this stuff out for themselves, because if they find it out for themselves, they're much more likely to remember it. And Kirshner and Sweller say, no, that's not true. If you leave them to find it out for themselves, then all of their brain power will go into the finding out process, and none of their brain power will go into the problem solving process. And they'll remember the fact they didn't like having to search for it. They won't remember what they actually found. Almost the complete opposite of the way that thinking about teaching had been going before. And incredibly seductive to people like me, who, my style of teaching is get up at the front and talk because I just don't trust them to know anything. And so it's quite nice to have some researchers going, actually, that's the right way to do it. And so we have cognitive load theory. And it says that learning is only effective if the working memory capacity has not been exceeded. And that the kind of load that falls on your memory falls into three types. Intrinsic load. Now, intrinsic load is how hard is the idea, and you're always going to have some things in your subject that you're teaching that are just hard. Wave particle duality, it is hard, and there's nothing you can do about that. So the intrinsic load, you've got no choice over. The extraneous load, however, you should have loads of choice over. The obvious extraneous load, and the one that's exercised this school, is low-level disruption. If you want them to be thinking about wave particle duality and they're actually thinking about the fact that Bobby next door is kicking them, then then all of their working memory capacity is being taken up with thinking about how they're going to get Bobby back later on at school and steal his bag or whatever, and very little of their working memory capacity is going towards thinking about things that we want them to think about. And so extraneous load is the bit that we can tackle. We can try and cut down on the low level disruption. We can try and make sure that our PowerPoints and things aren't full of lots of jazzy stuff that got nothing to do with what you're trying to teach them. That they are, you're not throwing lots of extraneous things at the kids. You're getting them thinking about what you want them to think about. And then finally, germane load. Germane load is basically good teaching. Germane load is how do you structure what you're teaching so that it matches the students in front of you? How much support do you give them? How much scaffolding? Germane load is basically how much scaffolding are you applying when you're doing your teaching? So your aim as a teacher is to limit the extraneous load and to match your germane load to the students. Nothing at all you can do about the intrinsic load. That's the essentials of cognitive load theory. Now, for me, it's got some problems. I hadn't thought of this one, but pretty much everybody else who's ever criticised it, this is their first thought, is that there are learning there are learnings that take place in environments that are completely full of distractions, and that surely no learning should be taking place because the working memory is being overloaded by everything else that's going on. And the number one example of that is early language acquisition. We know that small children acquire language really easily, and yet you'd think that if it relied on their cognitive load not being overloaded, then a small child's cognitive load is almost always overloaded. There's so much new and interesting going on around them. How on earth have they got any cognitive load left to do their language acquisition? And yet they do their language acquisition really easily. So clearly that's an issue. The answer that's given is to steal a bit from evolutionary psychology, which is to say that some things are evolutionarily hardwired into us, and that language acquisition amongst children is hardwired into us. So the brain is all set up to build those pathways of learning right from birth, and that a child is just built to acquire language, whereas a teenager trying to acquire yet another language finds it very hard because all of that plasticity in their brain has gone, and now they really do need the cognitive load not to be overdone if they want to have enough thought process left to them to learn a new language. The thing that always strikes me about CLT is, 7 small things held in your memory is no way reflects what you've got to be thinking about in order to understand what the hell I'm talking about in physics. That even the best behaved class I've ever had in a physics lesson, there's still going to be 1 or 2 of them being pains, and that's going to distract them. And I'm talking about something really, really complicated. 7 things in buffers in their brain just doesn't touch upon what the cognitive processes that have got to go on in my class. And so CLT sort of fails on that front for me. But again, they have a sneaky way around, and the reason that I did schema last week. And the sneaky way around is to say that one of these single items in your working memory can be an entire schema. So they don't have to be 4 to 7 little tiny factoids. The word peanut I used earlier on. They could be really complex schema that we've built throughout all of our physics on particle physics for the past few weeks, so that by the time I'm getting to wave particle duality, they can pop that schema into one of their working memory slots, and they've still got space left over to add in new things, and they've got take on board new things, and there's still a bit of space to cope with the fact that some kid in the corner there is not paying any attention, is kicking the table. And so the cognitive load theory is really, to my mind, all about schema. If schema exists, then there's a chance cognitive load theory is true. Schema, as I said last week, are a little bit speculative, and therefore cognitive load theory, although the working memory bit it's based on, entirely nailed down in concrete, not so certain that cognitive load theory itself is quite as nailed down. But of course, building on last week, it does sort of tie everything together nicely. You're all growing the expertise and, more importantly, the potential to learn of your students by growing the appropriate schemas. If you've successfully built a schema within a kid's head, and then you give a lesson that involves them to put a bit more in that schema, then you can throw quite a lot at them because you're not overloading their working memory, because only 1 bit is being occupied by their working memory by all this really complex stuff, that 1 schema that you've been successfully building in your lessons. So it's attractive, this idea that you can build their expertise and therefore you can throw more and more at them, and that's still being encapsulated in quite a simple theory. And a good example of that, those of you who've been around with us for a few years will remember Pedro came and gave one of our talks when we went up to Howard Davis Farm. And he did this thing that I was not certain he explained very well, where he did this very complicated set of rules on how you had to pick a card. And then he asked us which card we were supposed to pick, and none of us got it right. And then he gave a description of some people in a pub, and he said which people in the pub are allowed to, which person in the pub not actually allowed to drink, and we all knew. And logically, the rules for how the cards behaved were exactly the same rules for who's allowed to drink in the pub. The logic of the two was identical, but we all knew what was going on in the pub because we've all got a schema for what happens in the pub, and nobody knew what was going on with the cards because nobody had a schema for what was going on in the cards. So our working memories were utterly overloaded with the silly rules when we were thinking about the cards, whereas only one slot of the working memory is taken up when we're thinking about people in the pub, because we just pop up the schema for drinking in the pub and we all instantly know what the answer is. So this is used as a convincing, working memory is true. I'm not 100% convinced because I think there's also an element of caring. I don't think many of us, when we were sitting in Howard Davis Farm, really cared, whether it was an 8 with a red background that was the card we were allowed to pick, whereas quite a lot of us care about who's allowed to drink in the pub. So, but frequently, given this particular one, it's called the Watson selection rule, is given as why working memory is cognitive load theory, is true. So I gave you the different types, and here's just a nice summary of the different types of cognitive load. And the germane load is really the important one that we're thinking about designing and teaching, and the extraneous load is the thing that we're trying to reduce. Now, cognitive load theory, having been around since the 1980s, has gained all of these sort of add-ons, all these extras that all get called effects. And one of them, modality effect, and this is using the fact that there might be different working memories to increase the learning potential. And Mayer has a thing called dual coding, which is different to somebody else's dual coding, but Mayer has a thing called dual coding, where you watch images on a screen and you listen to narration. And so the images, they're going into your spatial buffer, the narration's going into your language buffer. Because you've got two separate buffers on the way, you can hold more stuff in your head at once and learn faster. That's using the different modes of working memory is the modality effect. Split attention effect. I think loads of us are guilty of the split attention effect. This is where you put up a PowerPoint and you've got a diagram on the PowerPoint, but you've also got some text, and the text and the diagram are separated from one another. So the kid's got to remember the text and then transfer it across the diagram. They've got to remember the diagram and transfer that across the text, meaning that they're taking up all of their working memory by remembering those things as they switch between them. Whereas if the text was built in and part and parcel of the diagram, they wouldn't be having to do that switching between and remembering everything. Worked example effect. This is if you look up cognitive load theory, all of the papers are about, we did a worked example and the kids learned better. It's about scaffolding. As I talked about, germane load scaffolding. And then this is another scaffolding. Essentially, the completion problem effect is you're given partially completed problems. That reduces how much of the problem they've actually got to consider, which means they can put more brain power into the remaining part of the problem and hopefully come up with better answers. This is the one that really irritates me, expertise reversal effect. There are, as I said, there's lots of papers about worked examples, and there's quite a few papers out there with worked examples where they find the worked examples don't help at all. And instead of going, well, that means that there's a problem with cognitive load theory, they go, it's expertise reversal effect. Which is basically saying if you give them too much scaffolding when they've gained some level of expertise, what you basically do is you annoy them and they stop paying attention, so they don't do as well. So you've got to make sure that your germane load actually matches the kids in front of you. If you've been doing worked examples for a bit of maths for some time now, you carry on doing worked examples, then the kids' performance actually starts to go down because you're not ever giving them a chance to take it any further. So, but my problem with expertise reversal effect is that it means that cognitive load theory is never disputable, because if cognitive load theory ever doesn't work, they just go, expertise reversal effect. Well, yeah, okay. How do I ever disprove cognitive load theory? Because you're just going to tell me it was expertise reversal effect. But anyway, cognitive load theory, nice idea. You've got a limited working memory. You need the kids to be using that limited working memory to think about those things you want them to think about, because those things you want them to think about are going to build the schema. And once they've got a better schema, that's taking up less space in their working memory, so you can build an even better schema, and the kids learn things and their long-term memory is altered. If, on the other hand, you allow their working memory to get overloaded, they probably won't remember anything whatsoever that you've done. So, what to think about? Well, the obvious one is, how do you minimize extraneous load? Gall's talked a lot about the low-level disruption. But there's other things like lots of us are very tempted to overload our PowerPoints, bung loads of clip art and things on there, because we look at a PowerPoint with some new content on it and we think, crumbs, that looks boring. I mean, look at mine, it's all black on a white background. I mean, how dull is that? But of course, to somebody who's never seen that stuff before, the content is interesting. Well, you hope the content's interesting anyway. So there's no need to put clip art and animations and things all over it in order to maintain the interest, because the content's interesting. And even worse, if you're putting the clip art and things all over it, you're probably adding to their extraneous load and reducing how much cognitive load they're applying to the stuff you want them to learn. And there's also, are the tasks you're giving them actually about building the schema, or is the working memory being used on the task itself? If you give them a card sort, I'm well known for hating card sorts. Is there the entirety of their working memory based on the card, what's going on in the card sort, and none of their working memory going on for actually the stuff you want them to learn? Even last week's schema, I said schema are very like mind maps. So you perhaps went away thinking, oh, if I get them to draw mind maps, I've built their schema. I said there's some evidence to show that actually what happens is all of their working memory goes into the drawing the mind maps. None of their working memory goes into building any schema. And so if you actually want them to build schema based on mind maps, you've got to provide the mind maps. Otherwise, all their working memory goes into drawing nice little bubbles and lovely little arrows joining them together, and none of it goes into the stuff you actually wanted to go into. And of course, how do you target the germane load? When do you know that they've gained some expertise and need to be able to pull it back? Now, I suppose I would say that's experience, and that's something that sort of teachers have to learn, and all of us are going to get wrong at times. But start off heavily scaffolded, pull it back. Put a lot of scaffolding, simplify things enormously for your slightly weaker groups. Don't put in all that scaffolding. Don't oversimplify things for your better groups, because it actually may not help. So cognitive load theory doesn't necessarily mean pull back on everything, simplify everything black and white, everything pared down to the bare minimum, because once the kids have actually got that schema in there and are starting to build it, you've got to they after that bit of complexity, they're after a bit of germane load, and so you've got to provide them with some in order to keep them hooked in order to keep them building those schemas into more and more complicated things. Right, there you go. That was what, 20, 25 minutes on cognitive load theory. Probably only enough to scratch the surface. There are hundreds of books out there if it's a topic that carries on interesting you. There are thousands of research papers out there, and I'm anorak enough to read those every now and again. But if you just a quick fly through on CLT, make you know whether it has enough impact for you to be able to worth going away and thinking about for yourself and for your lessons. There you go. I hope that was useful to you.